Gunpowder tastes bitter, like burnt pennies and regret. Maeve knew the flavor intimately, rolling it over her tongue as she leveled the barrel. She had the city's most untouchable man dead to rights, a crimson laser sight burning a neon hole into the center of his forehead. He was supposed to beg. He was supposed to bargain with offshore accounts or scream for his guards. Instead, he poured a glass of amber scotch, looked directly into the blinding beam, and asked her to stay. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a hostage situation that lost its script. Rain slapped the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, vibrating violently through the rubber soles of Maeve's tactical boots. She crouched in the maintenance crawl space, her knees screaming in protest. A jagged piece of sheet metal had sliced through her cargo pants 3 floors down, and the blood had dried into a stiff, itchy crust against her left calf. She didn't feel like a phantom of death. She felt like a tired, damp rat trapped in a maze of galvanized steel and humming wires. The air in the shaft smelled of ozone and 50 years of undisturbed pigeon droppings. Below her, through the slotted grate, lay the inner sanctum of Gabriel Rossi. Maeve pressed 2 fingers against her throat, feeling the erratic thud of her pulse. She was hungry. It was a stupid, mundane thought, but her stomach let out a soft, hollow gurgle that sounded deafening in the enclosed space. She had skipped lunch to stake out the loading dock, subsisting entirely on lukewarm coffee and half a roll of antacids. Assassins in movies never had indigestion. They never had cramps in their hands or blisters rubbing raw on their heels. Maeve had all 3. She carefully unscrewed the grate. The metal screws protested with tiny, high-pitched squeaks. She paused after each one, holding her breath until her lungs burned, listening for any shift in the room below. Nothing, just the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the storm outside and the low, constant thrum of the building's massive HVAC system. Lowering herself into the room required a drop of about 6 feet. Maeve hung by her fingertips for a second, feeling the coarse grip of her tactical gloves biting into her skin, and let go. She landed in a crouch on a thick Persian rug. It absorbed the impact completely. The texture under her boots was overwhelmingly soft, a jarring contrast to the concrete and steel she'd been crawling over for the past 3 hours. She stood up slowly, her joints popping in the quiet room. Gabriel's office was nauseatingly rich. It didn't smell like a mob boss's lair. There was no metallic tang of violence in the air. Instead, it smelled like cedarwood, old paper, and a faint, sharp hint of bergamot. The walls were lined with actual, physical books, thousands of them, their spines cracked and worn, indicating they were read, not just displayed. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the city's smeared, rainy lights from the window. And there he was. Gabriel sat in a high-backed leather chair, angled away from her, staring out at the drowned city. He was wearing a dark suit, the jacket discarded over the arm of a nearby sofa. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to expose forearms corded with muscle and thick, dark hair. He held a crystal tumbler in one hand, resting it casually on the armrest. Maeve drew her weapon. The suppressed Glock 19 felt heavy, the stippled grip tape biting into her palm. She wiped her sweaty trigger finger on her thigh before resting it outside the trigger guard. She moved forward. Her boots were silent on the rug, but the damp fabric of her jacket let out a faint swish with every step. She closed the distance. 20 feet. 15. 10. She could see the grey creeping into the hair at the nape of his neck. He wasn't a young man. He was 40-something, bearing the physical weight of a syndicate that controlled the eastern seaboard. The file Sullivan had given her claimed Gabriel was a monster, a butcher who orchestrated massacres over breakfast. looking at the slope of his shoulders. He just looked tired. At 5 feet away, Maeve stopped. She thumbed the switch on the underbarrel module. A sharp click. The red laser sprang to life, a tight, focused beam cutting through the dim, cedar-scented air. It planted itself squarely on the back of Gabriel's head, glowing furiously against his dark hair. She tightened her grip. This was it. The payout was enough to get her out of the life, enough to leave the damp apartments, the burner phones, the constant, low-level paranoia that made her grind her teeth to dust while she slept. She inhaled, opening her mouth to speak, but her throat was completely dry. She had to swallow heavily, a loud, ugly sound in the quiet room before she could find her voice. "Don't move." Maeve's voice didn't sound cool or commanding. It sounded raspy, strained by the sheer exhaustion of the climb and the adrenaline flooding her system. Gabriel didn't flinch. He didn't drop his glass. The ice cubes inside the tumbler clinked softly as he took a slow, measured sip. "I suppose," Gabriel said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. "The lock on the rooftop access door was as useless as I told them it was." He didn't sound panicked. He sounded like a man discussing a plumbing issue. Maeve stepped to the side, maintaining her distance, moving until she was in his peripheral vision. The red dot slid from the back of his head, dragged across his temple, and finally came to rest right between his eyes as he slowly turned his head to look at her. He didn't look like a monster up close, either. His face was a map of bad decisions and hard years. There was a thin, white scar pulling at the left corner of his mouth, and deep, bruised-looking bags under his dark eyes. He looked at her, then down at the gun, then up at the red dot reflecting faintly on the bridge of his own nose. "Smile like it's a joke," Maeve said, her voice shaking slightly. She hated that it shook. "Red dot on your head." She expected him to freeze. She expected the self-preservation instinct to kick in, the widening of the eyes, the rapid breathing, the desperate negotiation. That was how it always went. Men of power were cowards when the power was stripped away. Gabriel looked at her. Really looked at her. He took in her soaked tactical gear, the drying blood on her pant leg, the way her shoulders were hiked up around her ears from tension. He looked at her face, pale and streaked with soot from the ventilation shaft. And then the corners of his mouth twitched. The scar stretched. He smiled. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't a mocking, arrogant grin. It was a soft, genuine, devastatingly sad smile. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, making him look suddenly, painfully human. "Stay," Gabriel said softly. "Please." Maeve's breath hitched. A sharp, hot pain flared in her chest, a sudden spike of sheer confusion. "Stay. Not don't shoot. Not I'll pay you double. Stay." "Shut up," she snapped, adjusting her grip on the gun. The barrel wavered by a fraction of an inch. The red dot danced on his forehead, a frantic firefly. "Put the glass down. Put both hands on the desk." Gabriel didn't move to obey. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, seemingly unbothered by the loaded weapon pointed at his skull. "You're shivering," he noted quietly. "I said shut up. Sullivan sent you, didn't he? Or was it Dominic?" Gabriel took another sip of his scotch. The smell of the alcohol reached her, sharp and peaty. "Doesn't matter. They always send someone when the rain is heavy. Think it covers the sound of breaking glass." "Hands on the desk," Maeve repeated. Her forearm was cramping. The 3-pound weight of the Glock felt like 50. She wanted to pull the trigger and end it. It was a microscopic movement of the index finger. 3 pounds of pressure. That was all it took to turn a breathing man into a meat sack and secure her freedom. But her finger wouldn't move. She stared at the red dot. She stared at his smile, which hadn't faded. It was like a physical barrier, thicker than bulletproof glass. "Why aren't you begging?" she demanded, the words slipping out before she could stop them. It was a breach of protocol. You don't talk to the mark. You don't ask them questions. You put them down and you walk away. "Would it work?" Gabriel asked, tilting his head slightly. The dot slid to his eyebrow. "No." "Then why waste the breath?" He finally set the glass down on the mahogany desk. The clink of crystal against wood was startlingly loud. "I'm tired, sweetheart. I've been waiting for a red dot to appear in my peripheral vision for 20 years. Now that it's here, it just feels anticlimactic." He stood up. Maeve took a rapid step back, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. "Sit back down. I will shoot you. I will blow your fucking head off. I swear to God." Gabriel held his hands up, palms open, showing they were empty. He didn't step toward her. He just moved to the side of the desk, leaning his hip against the polished wood. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, casting a long, dark shadow across the Persian rug. "I know you will," he said gently. "You wouldn't have made it through the shaft if you weren't capable. But before you do it, just put the gun down for a minute. Your arm is shaking so badly, you're going to pull the shot and hit my jaw. That's a messy way to die." The sheer audacity of the statement hit her like a physical blow. He was critiquing her form. He was right, too. Her arms were trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. "You're insane," she whispered. "Probably," Gabriel agreed. He gestured to a leather armchair opposite the desk. "Sit, have a drink. If you're going to kill me, at least let me have some company for my last 10 minutes. It's quiet in here." Maeve stared at him. Her brain felt like it was short-circuiting. Every instinct, every hour of training, screamed at her to squeeze the trigger. Sullivan would kill her for this hesitation. He would have her hunted down and gutted in an alleyway. Yet she didn't shoot. The rain battered the glass. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked methodically. The heavy, warm scent of cedarwood wrapped around her, pulling her down like gravity. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered her arms. The red dot slid down his face, down his chest, and settled on the floorboards between his feet. She didn't holster the weapon, keeping it gripped loosely by her side, but the immediate threat was paused. Gabriel let out a long, slow exhale. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, and she saw the bone-deep terror he had been hiding behind that smile. His hands were shaking too, she realized. He curled them into fists, pressing them against his thighs to steady them. He was terrified, but he was asking her to stay anyway. Silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding, the kind of silence that feels heavy in the lungs. Gabriel turned his back to her, a move so stupidly arrogant or profoundly trusting that it made Maeve raise the gun an inch before stopping herself. He walked over to a crystal decanter resting on a side table. He poured a second glass of scotch, the amber liquid splashing softly over a single, large cube of ice. He turned back and held it out to her. Maeve didn't move. Her boots felt rooted to the expensive rug. Water dripped from the hem of her tactical jacket, forming a dark, expanding stain on the intricate wool pattern. "I don't drink on the job," she said, her voice flat. "You're off the clock the moment you lower the weapon," Gabriel countered softly. He took a step forward and set the glass on the edge of the desk, closest to her. "Take it. It'll help the shakes." She looked at the glass. Condensation was already forming on the crystal. Her mouth was a desert. Slowly she stepped forward, reaching out with her left hand while keeping the Glock firmly in her right. Her fingers brushed the cold glass. She picked it up and took a sip. It burned. It was smooth, rich, and tasted like smoke and expensive peat. It sent a fiery trail down her throat, warming her stomach instantly. She let out a ragged sigh, closing her eyes for a split second. When she opened them, Gabriel was watching her intently. "Better?" he asked. "It doesn't change anything," Maeve said defensively, gripping the glass tighter. "I still have a contract. I still need the money." Gabriel nodded slowly, leaning against the desk again. "How much?" "None of your business. I'll triple it." Maeve let out a harsh, cynical laugh. It sounded ugly in the elegant room. "There it is. The bargain. I knew it was coming. You play the zen, accepting Marta for 5 minutes, and then the checkbook comes out." Gabriel didn't look offended. He looked exhausted. He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting the neat, silver-flecked strands. "It's not a bargain to save my life. It's a bargain to buy yours." Maeve frowned, lowering the glass slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Sullivan," Gabriel said, the name like a curse. "He pays well, but he leaves loose ends. You think you walk out of here tonight, collect your duffel bag of cash, and retire to a beach somewhere? He'll have you killed before you reach the city limits. You know my face. You know his layout. You're a liability." Maeve stared at him. She knew this. Deep down, in the cold, rational part of her brain, she knew Sullivan was a snake. She had planned for it. Burner cars, fake passports, a route through the Rust Belt to lose any tails. But hearing Gabriel say it out loud made the plan sound childish, frail. "I can handle Sullivan," she lied. "No, you can't," Gabriel said gently. It wasn't an insult. It was a statement of fact. You're a ghost, sweetheart. A tool. And tools get discarded when the job is done. He looked away, staring out the rain-streaked window, the neon lights of the city reflected in his dark eyes. "I'm tired of it all. The blood, the paranoia, the endless grinding wheel of it. If you pull that trigger, you take my place on the wheel. You'll spend the rest of your short life looking over your shoulder, waiting for the red dot." He turned his gaze back to her. "Stay." "Why?" Maeve's voice cracked. She hated herself for it. The cynical, hardened shell she had spent years building was fracturing under the weight of this bizarre interaction. "Why do you want me to stay? I broke into your home. I put a gun to your head." Gabriel looked down at his own hands. "Because for the first time in 20 years, someone looked at me and didn't see a boss or a monster or a paycheck. You saw a man, and you hesitated." He looked up, his expression painfully raw. "In my world, hesitation is a death sentence. But tonight it's the only human thing I've seen in a decade." Maeve didn't know what to do with that. It was too heavy. It was too real. She looked down at the gun in her hand. The black metal looked alien to her suddenly, a piece of cold machinery designed to extinguish warmth. She looked at Gabriel. The scar, the tired eyes, the expensive suit covering a body that was just as fragile as hers. "If I stay," Maeve said slowly, the words feeling foreign on her tongue, "Sullivan will send someone else tomorrow. I know. We'll have to kill them. I know." Maeve took another sip of the scotch. The fire in her chest was spreading, melting the ice that had calcified around her heart over the years. It was terrifying. It was a stupid, reckless, entirely illogical decision. She walked over to the leather sofa. She didn't sit down, but she placed the Glock on the cushion. The dull thump of the heavy metal sinking into the leather sounded like a gavel dropping. She turned back to Gabriel. He hadn't moved, but the tension in his shoulders had visibly drained away. He looked at the gun on the sofa, and then at her. "My boots are ruining your rug," Maeve pointed out, her voice devoid of its earlier edge, replaced by a hollow, ringing exhaustion. Gabriel smiled again, that same soft, devastating smile. "It's a cheap copy anyway." He pushed off the desk and walked over to her. He didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her space. He just stood near her, looking out the window at the rain. Maeve stood beside him. They were two ghosts, haunting the same expensive room, surrounded by a city that wanted them both dead. The red dot was gone, but the crosshairs, she knew, were still firmly fixed on their backs. For the first time in her life, Maeve found she didn't entirely mind. Adrenaline is a filthy liar. It convinces the body it is a machine, immune to gravity, friction, and consequence. When it finally burns out, the withdrawal is a physical collapse. It hit Maeve 10 minutes after she set the Glock on the leather sofa. A violent, uncontrollable shiver racked her spine, rattling her teeth together with an audible click. The dampness of her tactical gear, previously a minor annoyance, suddenly felt like a sheath of freezing ice clinging to her skin. Her left leg, where the sheet metal had bitten into her calf, throbbed with a slow, sickening heat. She swayed. She didn't fall, catching herself on the edge of the heavy mahogany desk, but the sudden weakness made her stomach pitch. Gabriel noticed immediately. He didn't rush toward her, a smart move, considering her right hand twitched instinctively toward the empty holster at her hip. Instead, he set his empty glass down and took a slow step back, keeping his hands visible. "There's a bathroom through that door," he said, nodding toward a frosted glass pane on the far side of the office. "Towels, heat, a first aid kit under the sink. You're dripping on the floorboards, and you look like you're about to pass out." Maeve wanted to snap at him, to tell him she was fine, but her jaw was locked in a tight, shivering grimace. She nodded once, a jerky mechanical motion, and forced her legs to move. The bathroom was larger than her entire apartment. It smelled of eucalyptus and hot stone. The floor was lined with dark slate tiles that radiated a subtle, artificial warmth against the soles of her boots. She locked the door behind her, a heavy, satisfying click, and leaned heavily against the marble vanity. Catching her reflection in the mirror was a mistake. She looked feral. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull with sweat and rain. Streaks of black soot smeared across her cheekbones like war paint. Her eyes were bloodshot, the pupils blown wide. She looked exactly like what she was, a killer who had survived her own execution by an absurd stroke of luck. With stiff, clumsy fingers, she stripped off the heavy tactical jacket, letting it drop to the floor with a wet slap. The black long-sleeve shirt underneath was clinging to her ribs. She peeled it off, shivering violently as the cool air hit her bare skin. She turned on the faucet. The water ran hot almost instantly. She cupped it in her hands, splashing it over her face, scrubbing at the soot until her skin was raw and pink. The heat felt agonizingly good. Then came the leg. She sat on the edge of the massive soaking tub and unlaced her left boot, pulling it off with a wince. The cargo pants were glued to her calf with dried, crusty gore. She found a pair of trauma shears in the massive metal first aid box under the sink and simply cut the fabric away, exposing the wound. It was ugly, a jagged 6-inch tear, inflamed and oozing sluggishly. She poured hydrogen peroxide directly over the cut. The chemical hissed, bubbling up in a white, frothy foam. Maeve bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper, stifling a groan. She wiped it clean with a sterile gauze pad, the rough texture scraping the raw nerve endings, before wrapping it tightly in a fresh bandage. When she finally unlocked the door, Wrapped in a thick, white terry-cloth bathrobe she'd found hanging on the back of the door, her wet clothes bundled in her arms, Gabriel was waiting in the office. He had changed, too. The ruined suit jacket and tie were gone, replaced by a thick, dark grey cashmere sweater. He was standing by a small kitchenette tucked into the corner of the room, pouring boiling water into a French press. The rich, dark scent of roasted coffee beans overpowered the lingering smell of rain and cedar. He glanced up as she walked in. He didn't stare, didn't make a comment about the oversized robe swallowing her frame. He just pushed a heavy ceramic mug across the granite counter. "Black," he said. I assumed. Maeve dropped her wet gear onto the slate tiles of the entryway. She walked over, her bare feet silent on the rug, and picked up the mug. The heat seeped into her palms, grounding her. She took a sip. It was bitter, strong enough to strip paint, and exactly what she needed. "You're taking this remarkably well," Maeve rasped, her throat still tight. "Considering a professional hitwoman is currently wearing your bathrobe and drinking your coffee." Gabriel leaned back against the counter, blowing softly on the surface of his own coffee. The white scar on his mouth pulled tight. "I'm 52 years old, Maeve. I've been shot twice, stabbed once, and I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night since the Clinton administration. Panic is a luxury I lost the capacity for a long time ago." She paused, the mug halfway to her mouth. "How do you know my name?" "Sullivan isn't the only one with a Rolodex," Gabriel replied, his voice entirely devoid of smugness. It was just a tired, heavy fact. "When rumors started circulating that a contract was out, I made some calls. I knew he'd send you. You're quiet. You don't leave a mess." He looked at the gun resting on the sofa. "Usually. If you knew I was coming, why were you just sitting there?" "Because running is exhausting." Gabriel looked out the window. The storm was finally breaking, the relentless downpour easing into a fine, miserable mist. The city lights were beginning to bleed into the dull grey of approaching dawn. "I told you. I was tired." "And now?" Maeve asked, wrapping both hands around the mug to stop them from shaking. "Now you're suddenly energized to fight a war?" Gabriel turned to look at her. His dark eyes were bottomless, stripped of any pretense. "No, but you're here now, and I find that I don't want you to die for my fatigue." The quiet sincerity in his voice felt like a physical weight. Maeve looked away, staring down at the dark, oily surface of her coffee. She was a weapon. Weapons didn't have feelings. They didn't feel gratitude or confusion or this strange, hollow aching in the chest. "Sullivan will hit the building by noon," she said, shifting the conversation back to the cold, hard realm of logistics. It was safe there. "When I don't check in, he'll know it went sideways. He won't send another scalpel. He'll send a hammer." "I know," Gabriel said softly. "Drink your coffee. Then we need to break open the armory." Morning arrived, not with sunlight, but with a creeping, bruised purple hue that seeped through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a glass cage suspended in the smog. The smell of Hop's No. 9 gun solvent was sharp and chemical, completely overriding the lingering aroma of espresso. Maeve sat cross-legged on the floor, the oversized bathrobe pooling around her. A disassembled Sig Sauer MCX assault rifle laid out on an oily rag over the Persian rug. Gabriel had pulled back a false wall behind a bookshelf, revealing a steel-reinforced vault that belonged in a military compound, not a luxury apartment. "You prep for the apocalypse, Rossi?" Maeve asked, racking the charging handle of the reconstructed rifle. The metal-on-metal clack was sharp, authoritative, and deeply comforting to her frayed nerves. "I prep for Tuesday," Gabriel replied from the desk. He wasn't acting like a helpless target anymore. The weary, sad man from the night before had compartmentalized. In his place was the tactician who had kept a chokehold on the city's underbelly for 2 decades. He was studying a set of architectural blueprints spread across the mahogany wood, a red grease pencil in his right hand. "The elevators require a biometric scan to reach this floor," Gabriel murmured, circling a point on the blueprint. "They can override it from the basement security hub, but my men down there will buy us 10 minutes. "Your men work for money," Maeve corrected, slapping a loaded magazine into the rifle and setting it aside. She pulled a heavy, tactical vest from the pile Gabriel had provided. "If Sullivan is coming, he brought a bigger checkbook. Don't count on the lobby." Gabriel paused, the red pencil hovering over the paper. He didn't argue. He knew the psychology of his own world better than anyone. Loyalty was a liquid asset. "You think they'll come through the stairwell?" he asked. "Stairwell is a bottleneck. Too easy to defend," Maeve said, standing up. The cut on her leg pulled painfully, a sharp, hot reminder of her mortality. She ignored it, shrugging the heavy Kevlar vest over her shoulders. It was too big, hanging loose over her frame. But she pulled the Velcro straps tight until it squeezed her ribs. "They'll use the roof or the windows." Gabriel looked at the massive expanse of glass surrounding them. It's reinforced glass, rated for hurricane debris. "It's not rated for C4, Gabriel," Maeve said, walking over to the window. She pressed her hand against the cold, thick pane. The city below was a sprawling, jagged tapestry of concrete and steel, waking up to the morning commute. Thousands of people crawling like ants, entirely oblivious to the fact that 400 feet above them, 2 people were calculating angles of death. Gabriel walked up behind her. He didn't crowd her, maintaining a careful 3 feet of distance, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. He smelled of clean linen and the faint, metallic tang of the ammunition he'd been handling. "Why did you get into this line of work?" he asked quietly. "It was a violation of the rules. You don't ask about the past. The past is a liability." Maeve kept her eyes on the street below. "Because I was good at being invisible, and the pay was better than waitressing. You don't strike me as someone who cares about money. I care about what money buys." "Which is?" "Distance," Maeve said, turning her head slightly to look at him over her shoulder. "Enough distance from the rest of the world that nobody can touch me." Gabriel held her gaze. The deep, bruised bags under his eyes seemed heavier in the pale morning light. "Has it worked?" Maeve looked back at the glass. She thought about the empty apartments, the burner phones, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety that lived at the base of her skull. She thought about the cold barrel of the Glock and the red dot resting on the forehead of the only man who had ever asked her to stay. "No," she whispered. The silence between them stretched, fragile and loaded. It wasn't the tense silence of a standoff anymore. It was the heavy, shared quiet of 2 inmates waiting for the executioner's heavy boots in the hallway. Gabriel reached out, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second before his fingers gently brushed the collar of the oversized vest she wore. He adjusted a twisted nylon strap, his knuckles brushing against her collarbone. The touch was entirely utilitarian, yet it sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. "We hold the hallway," Gabriel said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a cold, authoritative cadence. "We don't let them breach the main office. Too many angles. If we funnel them into the corridor, we have the advantage of cover behind the marble pillars." Maeve nodded, stepping away from the window, breaking the strange gravity between them. She picked up the Sig Sauer and slung it over her shoulder. She checked the chamber of her Glock, slamming the magazine home with the heel of her hand. The professional killer was back online. The software had rebooted, but there was a virus in the system now. A glitch. She wasn't fighting for a paycheck anymore. She was fighting because the man beside her had looked at her with tired, sad eyes and treated her like a human being. It was the stupidest, most dangerous reason to pull a trigger she had ever encountered. Suddenly, the heavy, reinforced oak door at the far end of the penthouse buzzed. It wasn't a doorbell. It was the harsh, grating sound of the internal security comms. A red light flashed rhythmically above the intercom panel on the wall. Gabriel froze. Maeve immediately raised the rifle, planting the stock firmly against her shoulder, the barrel trained squarely on the oak door. Gabriel walked slowly to the intercom. He pressed the button. Yeah, a voice crackled through the cheap speaker, warped by static. "Mr. Rossi, it's Leo down at the desk. The security feed to the parking garage just went dark. And, sir, the elevators have been called to the basement. I can't override them." Gabriel didn't blink. He didn't curse. He simply reached under the console and pressed a heavy, mechanical switch. A loud, solid clang echoed through the penthouse as the deadbolts on the reinforced door engaged automatically. "Get out of the building, Leo," Gabriel said calmly into the mic. "Take the stairs. Go home." He let go of the button and turned to Maeve. The sad, tired man was gone entirely. The syndicate boss, the survivor, stood in his place. He racked the slide of his own weapon, a heavy, matte black shotgun. "They're here," he said. The waiting is always worse than the bleeding. Maeve crouched behind a thick pillar of imported Italian marble in the grand hallway leading to the front door. The marble was freezing against her shoulder. The smell of gun oil and her own stale sweat mixed in the tight space. Her breathing was slow, measured, controlled. In through the nose for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth for 4. Gabriel was positioned 20 feet across the hallway, crouched behind a heavy, overturned oak credenza. He held the shotgun resting over the wood, his eyes fixed on the reinforced door. The silence was unnatural. The city outside was muffled by the thick glass. The only sound was the erratic, heavy thudding of Maeve's own heart in her ears. Then came the subtle hiss. It was faint, like a snake dragging its belly across dry leaves. Maeve recognized it instantly. It wasn't the door they were working on. "They're bypassing the steel," Maeve barked, her voice echoing sharply in the long corridor. "They're burning the hinges with thermite." A second later, a brilliant, blinding flash of white-hot light sparked from the edges of the heavy oak door. The smell hit them immediately, an acrid, chemical stench of burning wood and melting metal that stung the back of the throat. Thick grey smoke began to curl into the hallway, pooling on the ceiling like an inverted puddle. The heavy metal hinges groaned, a deep, structural scream as the thermite chewed through the steel pins. "Cover your ears!" Maeve yelled, dropping her jaw open to equalize the pressure in her skull. The breaching charge detonated. The explosion was a physical entity. It didn't just make a sound, it rearranged the air in the room. The reinforced door, weighing 300 pounds, blew inward off its ruined hinges, slamming into the opposite wall with a deafening, splintering crash. A shockwave of pulverized drywall, splintered wood, and blinding smoke blasted down the hallway. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut, as debris peppered the side of her face like tiny, stinging wasps. The concussion rattled her teeth, leaving a high-pitched, metallic ringing in her ears. Before the smoke even had a chance to settle, the first figures moved through the doorway. They were professionals, clad in black tactical gear, gas masks obscuring their faces, moving with liquid efficiency. No shouting, no wild firing, just the cold, mechanical sweep of laser sights cutting through the billowing grey smoke. Maeve didn't hesitate. The time for hesitation had died last night. She leaned out from behind the marble pillar, trusting her optic sight over her stinging eyes. The red chevron hovered over the center mass of the lead breacher. She squeezed the trigger. The Sig Sauer barked, a rapid string of 3 shots. The recoil punched backward into her shoulder, a familiar, bruising rhythm. The lead man jerked violently as the heavy 5.56 rounds punched through his Kevlar, dropping him instantly to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Gabriel opened up from the other side of the hall. The deafening roar of the 12-gauge shotgun was a terrifying sound in the enclosed space. A swarm of buckshot tore through the smoke, shredding the second man's legs, spinning him around before he hit the ground, screaming. The hallway descended into absolute chaos. The remaining attackers laid down suppressive fire. Bullets chewed into the marble pillar inches from Maeve's face. Tiny shards of stone exploded outward, biting into her cheek, drawing a hot trickle of blood. The sound was an overwhelming, continuous roar, a physical pressure that made her lungs ache. She ducked back, pressing her spine flat against the pillar, dropping the empty magazine and slamming a fresh one home. Her hands were operating on pure muscle memory, devoid of conscious thought. 3 more left! Gabriel roared over the din, racking the pump of the shotgun with a sharp clack. Maeve spun around the opposite side of the pillar, dropping to one knee to change her angle. Through the shifting smoke, she saw a tactical light sweeping toward Gabriel's position. She fired, aiming for the light. The glass shattered, and the man behind it grunted, stumbling backward into the drywall. Suddenly, a heavy, suffocating weight slammed into Maeve's chest. The impact threw her backward, her head cracking against the polished floorboards. The air was violently expelled from her lungs. She gasped, staring up at the ceiling, her vision swimming with black spots. She had been hit. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her training. She looked down. The heavy Kevlar vest had caught the round, trapping the bullet in the ceramic plate, but the kinetic energy had hit her like a sledgehammer. Her ribs screamed in agony. A figure loomed over her through the smoke, the dark, gas-masked face of a cleaner. He raised a suppressed submachine gun, the barrel pointing directly at her face. Maeve's rifle was entirely out of reach, skittering across the floor. She scrabbled desperately for the Glock at her hip, but her fingers were numb, clumsy with shock. The killer's finger tightened on the trigger. A deafening blast erupted from the left. The killer's chest simply caved in. He was lifted off his feet by the sheer force of the shotgun blast at point-blank range, thrown sideways into the ruined drywall. Gabriel stood there, the barrel of the shotgun smoking heavily. His face was smeared with grey ash, his jaw locked tight. He didn't look like a tired, sad man anymore. He looked like the devil himself. He dropped the empty shotgun, ignoring the final attacker who was scrambling back out the ruined doorway, retreating into the stairwell. The immediate threat was neutralized. Gabriel rushed to Maeve, dropping to his knees beside her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He grabbed the shoulder straps of her vest and hauled her up into a sitting position. Maeve coughed violently, a ragged, ugly sound, tasting plaster and copper. She grabbed his forearm to steady herself, her fingers digging into the thick wool of his sweater. "Vest caught it," she wheezed, struggling to pull oxygen into her bruised lungs. "I'm fine." Gabriel didn't let go. His hand moved to the back of her neck, his thumb pressing against her pulse point. It was an incredibly intimate, grounding gesture amidst the stench of cordite and death. His breathing was heavy, ragged. "They were testing our perimeter," Gabriel said, his voice a low, dangerous gravel. He looked toward the ruined doorway where the smoke was slowly thinning. "That was just the scouting party. The real hit is coming next." Maeve looked at him, feeling the warmth of his hand anchoring her to reality. She was bruised, bleeding, and trapped in a glass cage with a mob boss she was supposed to kill 12 hours ago. She spat a mouthful of bitter, dusty saliva onto the floor. "Good," Maeve said, grabbing her Glock and chambering around. "Let them come." Coughing tore through Maeve's chest like a serrated blade. Every gasp for air felt tight and shallow, restricted by the massive, blooming bruise she knew was forming beneath her ribs. The ceramic plate in the vest had saved her life, but it had redistributed the bullet's kinetic energy into her sternum. It felt like she had been kicked by a mule. She spat another mouthful of grey plaster onto the ruined Persian rug. The silence that followed the shotgun blast was heavy, ringing in her ears with a high, sustained whine. Gabriel was moving. He didn't stop to catch his breath. He stripped the dropped submachine gun from the cleaner whose chest he had just caved in, expertly checking the chamber and dropping the half-empty magazine to replace it with a fresh one from the dead man's tactical webbing. "Can you stand?" Gabriel asked, his voice flat, stripped of the gentle cadence from the night before. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the smoke slowly clear in the hallway. Maeve planted her hands on the floorboards, ignoring the sharp twinge in her left calf. She pushed herself up, her joints protesting with loud, rigid pops. "Yeah," she grunted, scooping up her Sig Sauer. The plastic grip was slick with drywall dust. "They'll send more. That was a probe. They wanted to see if you had private security holding the floor." "They know we don't now," Gabriel said. He walked back into the main office, his boots crunching over shattered glass and splintered wood. The beautiful, cedar-scented room was a graveyard of debris. The mahogany desk was pitted with bullet holes. "We can't hold this box. They'll blow the windows next and rappel from the roof. We need to move down." Maeve followed him, leaning heavily against the doorframe for a fraction of a second, to let a wave of nausea pass. The smell in the hallway was horrific, a dense cocktail of voided bowels, burnt flesh, and the sharp, acidic tang of thermite. It was the smell of her profession. Usually she was long gone before it settled. Today, she was marinating in it. "Elevators are dead," Maeve stated, wiping a smear of blood off her cheek where a piece of flying marble had grazed her. "Stairwell is a fatal funnel. If they have a team in the lobby, they're already climbing. We'll meet them halfway in a concrete tube with no cover." Gabriel walked to the far corner of the office, near the kitchenette. He crouched down, his fingers tracing the edge of a heavy, brass floor grate hidden beneath a small rug. "Service shaft," he muttered, pulling a small crowbar from a drawer under the counter. He jammed the iron tip into the grate and threw his weight backward. The brass groaned, then popped free with a metallic screech. A wave of cold, stagnant air rushed up from the dark hole. It smelled of rat droppings, ozone, and old grease. "It runs parallel to the main elevator bank," Gabriel explained, shining a small penlight down into the abyss. A rusted iron ladder bolted to the concrete wall descended into the darkness. "Drop straight to the sub-basement parking garage. No cameras, no biometric locks." Maeve stared at the dark square. Her ribs throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Climbing down 60 flights of rusted iron with a wounded leg and a bruised sternum sounded like a slow, agonizing way to die. But staying meant getting gutted by Sullivan's second wave. "Ladies first," Gabriel offered, a ghost of a smile touching the scar on his mouth. It was a bleak, gallows humor, but it grounded her. "If you drop that shotgun on my head, I'll shoot you myself," Maeve muttered. She slung her rifle across her back, tightening the strap so it wouldn't swing. Sitting on the edge of the hole, she swung her legs into the freezing draft. Her left boot scraped against the concrete. Pain flared up her calf, hot and bright. She bit her lip, tasting copper, and lowered her weight onto the first iron rung. It was coated in decades of slick, black grime. Her tactical gloves gripped the metal, but she could feel the grit rolling under her palms. "Move fast," Gabriel's voice echoed down from above as he swung onto the ladder, pulling the heavy brass grate back into place over their heads. The shaft plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. There is a specific kind of terror in total sensory deprivation. The world vanished, leaving only the cold iron under her fingers, the mechanical hum of the building, and the harsh, echoing rasp of her own breathing. They climbed down. 10 floors. 20. The repetitive motion became a grueling physical meditation. Reach, grip, step, lower. Every time Maeve extended her left leg, the torn muscle tore a millimeter more. She could feel the fresh, warm dampness of blood soaking through the makeshift bandage, sticking to the inside of her cargo pants. She wasn't a superhero. She was 32 years old, running on cheap coffee, a single shot of scotch, and adrenaline that was rapidly turning toxic in her veins. Her forearms began to cramp, the lactic acid burning like fire. Above her, Gabriel's breathing was heavy. He slipped once, his boot scraping violently against the concrete wall, sending a shower of loose rust down onto Maeve's head and shoulders. He caught himself with a sharp grunt. "You good?" she called up, her voice a harsh whisper swallowed by the massive shaft. "Just peachy," he lied. The exhaustion in his voice was palpable. Around the 40th floor, the shaft began to vibrate. It started as a low, structural hum, sending tiny shockwaves through the iron ladder. Then, the sound of grinding metal echoed through the concrete tube, growing louder, more frantic. Maeve stopped, pressing her face against the cold wall. "Gabriel!" "I hear it," he panted, halting a few feet above her. "They got the power back on in the main bank," she said, her stomach dropping. "They're bringing an elevator car down." Through a thin, vertical crack in the concrete, separating their service shaft from the main elevator shaft, a sliver of yellow light suddenly appeared, sweeping downward rapidly. The mechanical roar of the descending car was deafening. If Sullivan's men were in that car, they were bypassing the stairs entirely. They were heading straight for the lobby to regroup, or worse, sweeping the floors. "Keep moving," Gabriel urged, his boot nudging her shoulder. "If they spot us through an inspection hatch, we're fish in a barrel." Maeve ignored the screaming pain in her ribs and forced herself to climb faster. Her hands were numb, blistered under the gloves. The darkness was suffocating, thick with the smell of iron and dust. She focused entirely on the square of Gabriel's boots above her and the empty space below. 50 floors. 55. Her foot hit something flat. She froze, nearly losing her grip as her weight shifted unexpectedly. She kicked out gently. Metal rang out. It wasn't a rung, it was a landing platform. "We hit a maintenance deck," Maeve whispered loudly. Gabriel dropped down beside her in the pitch black. The platform was tiny, maybe 4 feet square, enclosed by chain-link fencing. "Sub-basement level 2, Gabriel breathed heavily, switching on his penlight. The beam cut through the swirling dust, illuminating a heavy steel door with a push bar. "This opens into the boiler room. The garage is just beyond it." Maeve unslung her rifle, rolling her stiff shoulders. Every muscle in her body felt like it had been tenderized with a hammer. She looked at Gabriel in the harsh glare of the flashlight. He looked terrible. The cashmere sweater was snagged and filthy, covered in rust and white plaster dust. His face was pale, the lines around his eyes carved deep with fatigue. But his hands, gripping the submachine gun, were perfectly steady. "Ready?" he asked. Maeve nodded. She didn't have the breath for words. She stepped up to the steel door, placing her hand on the cold push bar. She depressed it slowly. It clicked loudly in the silence, a harsh, metallic snap. She pushed the door open an inch. The air in the boiler room hit them like a physical wall. It was suffocatingly hot, smelling of stagnant water, burning fuel, and industrial bleach. Massive, cylindrical water heaters hummed violently, vibrating the concrete floor. The lighting was poor, a sickly, flickering, fluorescent yellow that cast long, distorted shadows across a maze of thick PVC pipes and steel scaffolding. Maeve slipped through the door, sweeping the muzzle of her rifle left and right. The deafening hum of the machinery was both a blessing and a curse. It covered the sound of their boots, but it also masked the approach of anyone else. Gabriel followed, letting the heavy steel door click shut behind them. They moved through the narrow aisles of machinery, keeping low. Maeve led, her eyes scanning the deep shadows between the boilers. The heat was making her nauseous. Sweat stung the cuts on her cheek, running in dirty tracks down her neck. They were halfway across the massive room when the trap snapped shut. It wasn't a tactical breach. It was an ambush born of sheer, ugly opportunism. A figure stepped out from behind a massive pressure tank just 10 feet in front of them. He wasn't wearing a gas mask or tactical gear. He was in a cheap, rumpled suit, holding a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. One of Sullivan's street-level enforcers, left to guard the basement exits. He didn't yell. He just raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. The blast was catastrophic in the enclosed space. Maeve dove sideways before he even fired, her instincts overriding her exhaustion. The swarm of pellets missed her head by inches, tearing into a high-pressure steam valve directly behind her. The pipe ruptured with a deafening, shrieking hiss. A massive cloud of scalding white steam violently erupted into the aisle, instantly blinding them. Maeve hit the concrete hard, her bruised ribs screaming. She lost her grip on the rifle, the weapon skittering away under a tangle of pipes. Through the roaring steam, a second man lunged. He tackled Gabriel. The two older men crashed to the floor in a brutal, heavy tangle of limbs. The submachine gun clattered away into the mist. Maeve scrambled to her hands and knees. The steam was burning her exposed skin, turning the boiler room into a terrifying, whiteout sauna. She couldn't see Gabriel. She could only hear the ugly, wet sounds of fists hitting flesh and raw, guttural grunts. She drew her Glock, trying to find a target, but the mist was completely opaque. Firing blindly meant risking a bullet in Gabriel's skull. A shadow loomed out of the white fog directly above her, the first enforcer pumping the sword off for a second shot. Maeve didn't have time to aim. She lunged upward from her knees, driving her shoulder squarely into his crotch. The man roared in pain, folding forward. Maeve grabbed the hot barrel of his shotgun with her left hand, pushing it toward the ceiling as he fired. The blast shattered a fluorescent light fixture above them, raining sparks and glass down on their heads. She brought the heavy steel grip of her Glock down on his temple. Once, twice. It wasn't elegant. It was a desperate, ugly struggle. The man's weight collapsed onto her, pinning her to the wet concrete. He smelled of cheap cologne and stale cigarettes. He was heavy, his dead weight crushing her injured chest. She pushed him off with a ragged scream, rolling onto her side, gasping for air. The steam was slowly thinning, drifting toward the ventilation grates. 10 feet away, Gabriel was on his back. The second attacker, a massive man with a shaved head, was straddling him, both hands wrapped tightly around Gabriel's throat. Gabriel's face was turning a deep, terrifying shade of plum. His hands were desperately clawing at the man's thick wrists, but his strength was failing. Maeve tried to raise her Glock, but her hand was shaking violently. Her vision was blurring at the edges, grey spots dancing across her retinas. The exhaustion was finally demanding its toll. She didn't shoot. She dragged herself forward, her boots slipping on the wet concrete. She reached her belt, pulling the 4-inch combat knife from its sheath. She threw herself onto the man's back, wrapping her left arm around his thick neck, and drove the blade deep into the space just below his collarbone. The man let out a horrifying wet gurgle. His hands instantly released Gabriel's throat as he reached up to clutch his own chest. Maeve twisted the blade viciously, then ripped it out. The massive man slumped sideways, crashing onto the concrete, dead before he stopped moving. Maeve collapsed backward onto her knees, dropping the bloody knife. Her chest heaved. The boiler room spun in sickening circles. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the intense urge to vomit. Gabriel rolled onto his side, coughing violently. He dragged oxygen into his lungs with harsh, desperate gasps. He didn't try to stand immediately. He just lay there in the damp grime, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Slowly, the roaring in Maeve's ears subsided, replaced by the hissing of the broken steam pipe. Gabriel pushed himself up onto his elbows. He looked at the dead man beside him, then looked at Maeve. He didn't say thank you. The look in his dark eyes transcended gratitude. It was a profound, deeply vulnerable acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid with offshore accounts or cash. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and grasped her forearm. His grip was tight, desperate, entirely human. "Come on," Gabriel rasped, his voice shredded from the strangulation. He pulled himself up, hauling her to her feet with him. "The garage is through the next door." Heavy steel yielded to Maeve's shoulder as the fire door swung outward. The cavernous expanse of the sub-basement parking structure swallowed them. It was freezing down here, a stark physical shock after the suffocating boiler room. The air tasted bitterly of exhaust fumes, stale motor oil, and damp concrete. Overhead, caged fluorescent tubes buzzed with a sickly, failing yellow hue, casting long, geometric shadows behind the structural pillars. Gabriel leaned heavily against the rough concrete wall, clutching his bruised throat. He pointed a shaking finger toward a black Audi resting near the VIP elevators. Maeve nodded. She kept her Glock raised, moving methodically between the massive pillars. Every scuff of her rubber soles seemed to echo infinitely in the empty vault. 30 feet. 20 feet. Hold it. The voice echoed from the dark pocket of space directly behind the Audi. It was casual, bored. Maeve froze, dropping her center of gravity, the Glock instantly tracking the sound. A man stepped into the sickly yellow light. Tailored navy suit, suppressed pistol held loosely at his thigh. Hayes, Sullivan's chief cleaner. "Gabriel," Hayes said, his polite smile failing to reach his dead eyes. "You look terrible." And Maeve, "I have to admit, Sullivan is profoundly disappointed. He thought you were a professional." "I received a better counteroffer," Maeve rasped, her voice eerily flat. Inside, her heart battered against her bruised sternum like a trapped bird. Hayes let out a dry chuckle. He didn't raise his weapon. From the shadows flanking the Audi, 2 more figures materialized. They wore heavy tactical gear, leveling short-barreled assault rifles squarely at Gabriel and Maeve. "The offer is void," Hayes said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward. "Sullivan wants the old man put down. He wants you gutted for the delay. Drop the pistol. I'll make sure they aim for the brain stem. It's the kindest severance package you'll get today." They were caught. No marble pillars to hide behind. No steam to blind the shooters. Just open, cold concrete. Gabriel let out a ragged, whistling sigh. He didn't raise his hands in surrender. Instead, he looked at Hayes with a profound, almost insulting boredom. "Hayes," Gabriel rasped, his voice a ruined croak. "You always were a sycophant. Sullivan pays you to clean his floors, and you just keep tracking shit onto the rugs." Gabriel stepped sideways. He moved entirely out of Maeve's shadow, intentionally placing himself in the open center of the driving lane. "Don't!" Maeve hissed. It was a suicidal maneuver. The two riflemen instinctively tracked his movement, their muzzles pulling away from Maeve for a fraction of a second to follow the primary target. Maeve didn't calculate angles. She didn't think about her burning ribs or her exhausted muscles. She operated on the cold, lethal muscle memory that had kept her alive this long. Her left thumb flicked the pressure switch on the Glock's underbarrel module. A thin beam of violent crimson cut through the grimy garage air. It didn't land on Hayes. It snapped directly onto the throat of the rifleman on the left. Maeve squeezed the trigger twice. The suppressed weapon spit two quiet, metallic coughs. The man crumpled inward, his rifle clattering harshly against the pavement. Before the second shooter could correct his aim, Maeve pivoted her wrists. She didn't look down the iron sights. She let the red dot drag a frantic, visible line across the concrete floor, up the tires of the Audi, and settle on the second man's sternum. Two more rapid pulls. He went down in a heap of dark nylon. But Hayes was a professional. As Maeve pivoted to put the laser on his tailored suit, Hayes snapped his pistol up and fired a single blind shot. The round caught Maeve's left bicep. It didn't lodge in the muscle, but the sheer friction of the near miss sheared through her sleeve, searing her skin like a branding iron. The impact spun her backward. She cried out, a raw, ugly sound, her left arm going completely numb. Hayes smirked, leveling his pistol directly at her face. He didn't account for Gabriel. Unarmed, wheezing, and running on pure fumes, Gabriel launched himself off his back foot. He slammed into Hayes with the chaotic, desperate weight of a cornered animal, grabbing the wrist holding the pistol. The gun discharged wildly, blowing a chunk of concrete out of the ceiling. They crashed violently against the hood of the Audi. Hayes was much younger, his muscles uninjured. But Gabriel fought with feral, terrifying intensity. He pinned Hayes's arm, driving a brutal headbutt directly into Hayes's face. The cartilage in Hayes's nose shattered with a sickening crunch. Hayes shrieked, dark crimson exploding down his white shirt, but he managed to wrench his gun hand free. He shoved the barrel toward Gabriel's ribs. "Smile," Maeve breathed. The red dot appeared squarely between Hayes's eyes, a furious, glowing ember against his pale skin. Hayes froze. His finger tightened on his trigger, but his eyes rolled up, trying to see the phantom light burning his forehead. Maeve pulled the trigger. The round caught Hayes perfectly. His head snapped backward against the Audi's windshield, spider-webbing the reinforced glass before he slid down the hood, leaving a thick, dark smear across the glossy black paint. The garage plunged into a ringing silence, save for the hum of the ventilation fans. Maeve lowered her heavy, smoking weapon. Her arm throbbed relentlessly, warm liquid running down her wrist. Her vision tunneled into a tight grey circle. Gabriel slowly pushed himself upright. He stared at Hayes's body, then reached into his slacks, pulling out a key fob. The Audi chirped cheerfully. "Get in," Gabriel whispered. Maeve stumbled to the passenger side. She collapsed into the seat, surrounded by the smell of rich leather and clean upholstery. Gabriel threw himself behind the wheel. The massive engine roared to life, violently echoing in the concrete box. Tires screaming, they launched toward the exit ramp, bursting through the rolling steel gate. Outside, the city was weeping. A heavy grey drizzle coated the asphalt, turning the streets into a dark mirror. Gabriel drove fast, his jaw locked tight, navigating toward the highway, toward anywhere else. Maeve rested her head against the freezing glass. She watched the smeared neon lights streak past. She was injured. She was broke. She had a syndicate boss in the driver's seat. Gabriel glanced at her. The jagged scar pulled into a soft, exhausted, deeply genuine smile. Maeve didn't smile back. She didn't have the energy. But as she closed her eyes, the cold, cynical knot in her chest finally unraveled. The red dot was gone. For today. That was enough. If you felt the adrenaline of Maeve and Gabriel's desperate escape, don't let the story end here. We thrive on bringing you gritty, character-driven narratives that pull no punches and keep you on the absolute edge of your seat. Do you want to see what happens when Sullivan finally catches up to them? Let us know. Hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with a friend who loves intense, grounded mafia thrillers. And most importantly, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next chapter of this explosive story. Stay tuned.